Welcome to the first video of my series which I'm going to do about my new book. Now this first video is going to be an introduction to the work. I'll give a quick outline of how it came to be and then get straight into it because I don't want to waste time. Some time ago I came across the work of a French political writer called Bertrand de Juvenel, who wrote a very important book called On Power. Now in this book, he covered the history of the centralization of power in Western orders. He wrote sometime after the Second World War, so his work kind of goes up to this period. And in a previous book, which I've called Nemesis, I carried on that exploration past this point and looked at our modern orders with that model in mind. And I also compared the model to the liberal model of human orders, which is based upon a kind of ontological anarchism. Now, there are a couple of problems with the book which I didn't address because I didn't have the resources to do so. One of them was the nature of the center in the model, because in the previous book I used de Juvenel's model of a high, middle, and a low. That's how human orders always orientate themselves. I'll show a picture on the screen as well at the moment for you to see what I'm talking about. Now, there are some problems with this because it's very hard to define what the center is. And I came to the conclusion that this was wrong, and this will be covered in the book in more detail later. And another problem was the issue of anthropology. It was covered in the previous book. It was not covered in a great amount of detail because the resources weren't really available at that time. But with this new book, I think I do have the resources to be able to give a better account of what's going on there. And it also helped to clarify the issue of the center of the order and why I was having such problems with it and why Juvenel was having such problems with it as well. But even then, a lot of what I cover in this new book is actually in On Power and de Juvenel's other work, Sovereignty, in a sort of embryonic form. So he was definitely on the right track, which is indicative of how so far ahead of his time he was. And it's been an absolute catastrophe that his work has been disregarded and ignored so much, which is something which I'm addressing in this work. Okay, so now to get into the actual first chapter of the book. It's a very short chapter, and the purpose of the book, the first chapter, was to provide the methodology of the work. Now, I've tried to use a scientific approach when addressing the issues in the book. And what this means is I followed the path of Alistair McIntyre to a degree in that I've employed what he calls immanent critique. Because when it comes to issues of politics and political theory, one of the great problems which we face is that it's very hard to define how or why one political system of thought is better than another. Now, one of the main problems with this is that in modernity, we don't admit that there's a shared good which we all live by, and we don't admit that there's any kind of standard definition of what a human is. Now, if you compare this situation to other areas of existence, this problem becomes quite stark. So, for example, if you wanted to evaluate a laptop, you would be able to do so quite effectively because we have a general consensus to what a laptop should be. And so we're able to evaluate against that consensus what it should be. So if you have a laptop and it's light, we'd say it's a good laptop. If the laptop switches on when you press the power button, again, it's functioning as a laptop, so it's good. If it runs the programs you want it to run, and it does what you want it to do, it's a good laptop. And we can do this with many other things, like, for example, an airplane. So if you board an airplane and the airplane takes off and it flies relatively smoothly to the destination and then lands and you can get off, then the airplane's a good airplane. However, if the airplane didn't do that and in mid-air the engine burst on fire and then it crashed into the ground and killed everybody, we'd say it's a bad airplane. Now, this can be, as I say, it can get complicated, but it's not actually that complicated. Normal people, the average person can process this quite easily. we can change the criteria as to what we expect of the object quite easily. So say, for example, you're a hijacker on 9/11. In this case, if the airplane took off and landed perfectly fine, it's not done its function that the 9/11 hijackers had in mind. It's not, because they've changed it from being a plane into a weapon. At that point, it becomes a good weapon if it crashed into the towers and took them down, which it did. So you can change the function of something and thereby change the evaluative criteria. Now, this all depends on the context in question. Now, this can get quite complicated because you can nest these teleologies into different narratives and different structures. Now, in everyday existence, normal people can do this quite easily without any problem at all. But in the field of ethics, ethical theorists, ethical philosophers just cannot process this type of thinking because they demand that ethics get put into these really rigid and really bizarre thought experiments, which are ripped away from any sort of narrative, any sort of context. So they're able to play in this weird little sandbox, which doesn't really have any relevance or link to reality. Now, this carries over into politics because the question of what a human is and what the purpose of humans are and what the purpose of our orders is an ethical question. So, well, to a degree it is anyway. In some other senses, which I get to in the book, it's actually an epistemological question. But this is something we'll not get stuck in at the moment. So the purpose of the first chapter was to address this problem by not addressing this problem. So when in the book I compare the model that I present in the book based on de Juvenal against liberalism and against Marxism, I'm not trying to do it in relation to some sort of shared agreement, because there is no shared agreement of what a person is or what the purpose of governance and structures and any sort of order is. So instead we take a different route where we actually sneak in a teleology, which someone following liberal theory should accept. Because it's only if you have a teleology that you can make an evaluative judgment about something. So the way to do this without forcing those different systems to adhere to your evaluative criteria, we take their evaluative criteria and then ask if they meet the criteria which they've set out. So what this means in practical terms is that we'll take what liberalism claims has happened and claims has happened with humans in the past, and then we'll measure this against the evidence which is available and the logical coherence of the claims that they're making by themselves. And then we'll evaluate using that system as to whether they've reached the criteria which they set out for themselves in the first place. Now, this isn't a perfect way of doing this because regardless of what evidence you could put before these people and what arguments you can put forward as regards to the incoherence of their position, this still requires on them entering into what McIntyre called an epistemological crisis. They have to be in a position where they see this, they accept it, and they realize that they have to make a jump into a different system because their system is wrong, it doesn't make sense, and it's not a viable position to maintain. Now, encouraging someone to get to that point is impossible unless they're willing to do that. So, to a degree, there's not really much more you can do after that point. If you present this case to them and you present all of this to them openly and they still don't jump from their position to another position, there is not much you can do. I mean, logically, you could say that they still have a point because regardless of the evidence that you supply or the logical arguments you make, they could still hold on to a degree of faith that these evidentiary problems could be resolved in the future and that the logical incoherence itself could also be resolved. Now, you kind of see that in the sciences as well, in that some positions which have been, to many people's eyes, discredited and disproven, have been held onto by others, and then at a later point they have come back and actually proved themselves to be correct or to be more accurate after more evidence has come through or more information has been processed. So there is a point where you can't conclusively disprove something 100%. So in the work, what I've done is followed what happens in the sciences as well, in that I've applied a probabilistic approach in that instead of saying that something is conclusively disproven in an absolute sense, we can just say it's probabilistically unlikely, which is what you see in physics as well. Because in physics, they are aware of this problem. It's Hume's problem. It's where you can't conclusively disprove that something will happen because it's happened consistently before. I mean, you could run an experiment 1,000 times and get the same result, but theoretically, you could technically get a different result if you run it again. And there's no way to disprove that, and there's no way to address that except through probability, which is what, if I use any sort of certain terms in the book, that's in relation to a probabilistic certainty. So I hope that's more clear at this point. Now, at a later point in the book, what I'll also do is attempt to do comparison with Marxism, the Juvenian model, and liberalism against a phenomenon in the real world, which will be revolutions. But before we can get to that point, we need to address the imminent critique. And how I'm going to do that is I'm going to focus on the state of nature argument, which underpins modern liberalism and Marxism to a degree, not fully, but to a degree. Marxism's a bit of a strange one. But with liberalism is premised on the state of nature, that we all started off as individuals and then we all voluntarily elected into orders. Now, modern liberals probably won't understand this or won't realize this, but that is the very basis of their political system. And that underpins economics, psychology in the modern form, sociology, political theory, all of that. So what I'm going to do in the next chapter, chapter 2, is to begin that process of assessing the state of nature, first of all through evidence, to try and find what evidence there is for any of those aspects of the state of nature, and then move on to looking at the logical coherence of the state of nature. Now, this becomes quite a complex task because it turns out that there's a lot of errors involved in this, which are actually highly sophisticated, and they'll only come to view when we actually employ the Juvenian model to look at what's happening there. So what we'll do now is we'll go straight into chapter 2 and begin to look at that process.